we wanted to offer this webinar so for any administrators who were unable to attend this summer to one of our face-to-face trainings. Just a reminder, this webinar is a condensed version of our summer webinar material. So I just wanted to let you know that we included most of the slides in the summer, so there'll be some slides that we'll go over quickly, but you'll have access to them later today. They'll be posted on the Project Success website. Welcome. My name is Heidi Brett Baker, and Ashley is here to join us too, and we'll show you those slides in just a couple of seconds here. We are, I think, having a little bit of technical difficulties. So today we're going to do some introductions, and then we are going to talk to you about improving student outcomes, the case for high expectations. Then we're going to talk to you about what does effective instruction look like, and then we're going to wrap it up and help you give you a template to create a plan for this upcoming school year, and then give you some next steps, and then tell you about some support that we'll be giving throughout the school year so that you will be able to be supported in your endeavors to improving those outcomes and helping move your staff forward to having those high expectations for students. So my name is Heidi Brett Baker. This is my second year on this Project Success team. Before I came to Project Success, I've kind of had a wide range of experience. I was a district administrator and a building level principal for in that combination for about 15 years. I also had the pleasure of working in higher ed for 5 years while getting my doctorate. And in that time, I wrote a program for students with intellectual disabilities to come to college and live on campus and attend college classes and work on campus and live in the dorms, just like any other college student. It was a great experience, an immersion of kind of what their age-like peers did. And then before that, I was a special education teacher for 14 years in a wide range. I've taught everything from preschool to those transition years. And now Ashley's going to join us and tell you a little bit about herself and continue on with the presentation.
Can you hear me now? Yay! Well, that was something. Okay. There we go. All right. There's my cute family again, even though y'all couldn't hear me talk about them. Indiana Resource Network, great resource for you. Recommendations, go to the DOE website, type in Indiana Resource Network in their search bar. You will see all of these resource centers and a list of them and what they do, a description of what they do. So we really just want people to know that these resources are out there, most of them at no cost to you. So if there's something you're struggling with and could use some additional support, definitely reach out and look for these resource centers on the DOE website. Wanted to mention quickly our fall regional trainings that are coming up. They will be targeting teachers who are new to the idea of working with students with significant cognitive disabilities. It may be that you've been a teacher of these students before, but you're new to Project Success and what we offer. It may be that you were previously a resource teacher and you're new to now working with students with more significant needs. Maybe you're a new teacher fresh out of college and you're just new to the whole idea of all of this. We really wanted to support those teachers in those areas. So the dates and locations have been set down there in the corner, and there's a link here for you to register. This PowerPoint that we're looking at here, as well as a recording of the presentation that we're giving, will be on our website later today, I believe. At least the PowerPoint will be. And all of these are hyperlinked, so you'll be able to get to that registration link that way. Our website is projectsuccessindiana.com. You have to make sure to get that Indiana piece in there. And in the future, when you want to get back to this presentation, you'll go to resources up in the upper right-hand corner. And then for today's presentation, you will select in the drop-down the Summer Institute 2019, because this webinar is part of our Summer Institute. You'll select that, and then it will bring you to a page that has all the resources that we talk about today, including the PowerPoint itself. So our main goal here today with all of this information is to focus on providing information to you all about how we can improve student outcomes. A lot of what we talk about today is going to be specifically through the lens of students with significant disabilities. However, a lot of the things we talk about, it's beneficial to students more broadly. So even though we may continuously mention students with significant needs, keep in mind that a lot of the things we talk about can be applied to students outside of that designation as well. The three sort of areas that we think about when we are targeting the idea of improving student outcomes are presuming competence in students, having high expectations for those students, and then operating under the least dangerous assumption. And those three things all sort of work together and meld together. And we'll talk just real briefly about what each of them mean and how they work together as we move forward. When we talk about students with significant disabilities, I think it's important to sort of clarify exactly who we're talking about. So this slide is just meant to give you some additional information about what that means. A lot of times people refer to the 1%, and so what does that mean? Well, it's the percentage of students who are identified with a significant disability, and off to the right-hand side there you'll see sort of the different ways that different organizations or the law identifies who should be in that 1%. So under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, it's the percentage of students who are working toward an alternate diploma. For the Federal Office of Special Education, it's the percentage of students who are taking the alternate assessment, and so forth. So it really is meant to be a very, very small population of students. It's not just any student who happens to be struggling or struggling quite a lot. It's a pretty unique thing to have a significant cognitive disability. So those are the students that we're talking about. Regardless of what percentage a student may be categorized as, that last square there about the Dear Colleague letter, I just want to point out that all students, regardless of where they fall, have the right to access grade level standards. And that's a huge part of what we'll talk about more today, and we're certainly happy to help you, to support you through that in the future as well, figuring out how does that even work. So we're going to start off with me attempting to make my case for why we should have high expectations for students with significant needs. It sometimes sounds a little wild. You know, there's a reason why these students have been identified with a significant disability, and now you're going to put all these expectations on them and make things super hard for them. Why would we do that? So I'm going to try to present some information here about making the case for having high expectations, while also pointing out that having high expectations doesn't necessarily mean having unreasonable expectations. So we're going to start with some assumptions. If you haven't seen this book before, this book's down in the right-hand corner, definitely recommend it. It's a fabulous resource for working with students with more complex needs, and that's where these flawed assumptions come from. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but the point of this is, in the past, when we have thought about students with significant needs, we've made these assumptions about intelligence and what it means to have intelligence and what it means to be able to accurately assess a person's intelligence, that some of these things, they're just not true. We've assumed them for a long time, and we've sort of operated that way for a long time. But come to find out, the more research that's being done and so forth, we're finding out that some of these things just aren't true. So the idea that intelligence can be reliably measured is false. And then thinking about, because it's not reliable, and then thinking about students with intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities, those things can be interchangeable. The idea has been for a long time, well, I mean, if they have this disability, this cognitive disability, they can't learn gen ed content. So there's no point to them being in a gen ed classroom. Both pieces of that are also false. Students with intellectual disabilities can learn gen ed academic content, and there is benefit to being in gen ed beyond just the academics. So both of those things we need to sort of look at reframing a little bit. And then the choice between a student being in gen ed or having their needs met, in the past we've viewed that as an either-or situation. Either we can say, okay, you can have access to gen ed. It's not going to be great for you. You're not really going to get your needs met, but you can be in gen ed. Or we can keep you back here and sort of wall you off a little bit and give you everything you need and meet all your needs, but we can't do both. We can't meet your needs and give you access to gen ed, and that's just not true. Now, it is quite tricky to figure out a great way to do both of those things, but it is possible. And so we'll talk more about where you can at least start to try to make that happen. This slide is one of the most important slides in this presentation, and so if you take nothing else away from today, I hope this is it. When we think about operating under the least dangerous assumption, I put that quote up there. It comes from research, technically from a while ago, 1984, so the idea has been around for a while. But the gist of it is that when we don't know for sure what a student can learn, whether it's because they have a difficulty communicating or they have a processing difficulty or whatever, and we just don't know for sure. When we make educational decisions for that student, we have to make the decisions that will ultimately have the least harmful effect on that student being able to function independently as an adult. And the best way I have found to sort of tease through what that actually means is to think through those two scenarios in the blue boxes. So if you have a student in mind, a student with a significant cognitive disability, maybe it's someone you've worked with before, and you think about their situation and think about if you assume that student, let's assume they can learn, so we're going to give them every opportunity to do so. But then some point down the road, years and years later, we get this magical brain scanning technology or whatever that informs us, you know what, actually they can't really learn much. That was just, they had sort of peaked and they were done and that was it. And there wasn't much we could do to help them learn. What then, right? What's the ultimate outcome? How have we harmed that student? If it turns out they couldn't learn, but we were still trying to give them these opportunities to learn. Not much harm being done to that student. The end result is still the end result, right? However, when we contrast that with that same student, if we think about, okay, what if we start off making the assumption that they can't learn? We see their IQ score, or we see the way they function, or whatever. And so we take that sort of surface view and we say, learning is not really their thing. It's not really going to happen for them too much. So we're not going to give them every opportunity to learn. We're going to kind of pull back and do, just these few things over here. But then this magical brain scanning technology comes out, and it turns out this student can learn and could learn all along. We just didn't know or couldn't see it, or they weren't showing it in a typical fashion. Then what? Then what harm has been done to that student? And it turns out quite a lot. So when we don't know for sure. And oftentimes with students with the most significant disabilities, we can't know. Their disability is preventing us from knowing what they are truly capable of. They could have all kinds of things going on in their brains, in their minds, that they're just not able to get out. So it's critical that we give those students opportunities to learn and make the assumption that they have capabilities, and it's our job to sort of tap into them and find a way to tap into them. The least dangerous assumption, then, is to have high expectations for all students. This is just another way of sort of saying that or thinking through it. When we're not sure what students can learn, we're going to presume competence in them. We're going to presume that they have an ability to learn. And so what does that look like? What does that sound like, to presume competence or to have these high expectations for students? So in the gen ed setting, it'll look like these students being included to the maximum extent appropriate. I think that's a phrase that we've heard a lot. We know students should be in the gen ed setting to the maximum extent appropriate. And I put an asterisk there because appropriate, to the maximum extent appropriate, does not mean to the maximum extent that is easiest for you as the teacher or you as the administrator to facilitate. So just because something is difficult or it is a struggle to get the schedule worked out to do this, that, and the other thing, or to get other teachers on board to be able to have this student be in a gen ed setting, that's not what maximum extent appropriate means. We really have to be having the student at the center of that when we're considering what it means to be appropriate. And I just think that's a critical piece. So we need to always be keeping in mind appropriate versus just what's easier to get through the day. Also, as far as presuming competence in our students, this will sound like using language that focuses on their abilities and their needs, but it's more specific language rather than just sort of classifying them by their disability or their level of functioning. So rather than just sort of saying, well, you know, my low-functioning kids, bop, 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 well, they may be low-functioning in an area or in several areas, but what are you really trying to communicate when you say that? Is there a specific need that you're talking about that you could be using a little bit more specific language about? It's important to be specific in that way rather than just painting them all with a broad brush, because that really does lower the expectations and lower what we believe that student is capable of. It is critical, if we presume competence in students, that they have a means to communicate. Not only a means to communicate, period, but a means to communicate about the same topics as their non-disabled peers. So there may be a high school student, let's say, who has a communication device and they're able to indicate that they need to use the restroom and that they're hungry or they'd like a snack or that they need a break. And then, you know, an interest of theirs, which is Paw Patrol. Now, that really may be their interest, and that is fine, but that is not doing them any, we're doing them a disservice to have that as a topic on there for them to communicate with peers, because more likely than not, their non-disabled peers are not perhaps interested in Paw Patrol, so we need to be sort of scaffolding this student to give them the ability to communicate about topics that are on age as far as their peers go. Presuming competence also looks like having IEP goals that are reflecting gen ed standards or content connectors, but those content connectors are also grade level as well. So we really need to make sure that IEP goals are targeting academic skills. It also sounds like speaking directly to students rather than speaking around or about them. It's real easy, especially for our students who are nonverbal or who are struggling to develop their language. It's easy to talk around them when they're right there, right? You may sort of forget that they're there listening to you, you know. So it's important to indicate to that student, speak directly to them and indicate to them that you believe they have value and that you see them and you recognize them and you are incorporating them in the classroom. And lastly, just when we are presuming competence in students, it means that we are using age-appropriate vocabulary with them, topics, age-appropriate topics, and also being careful with your inflection. So not talking to your students as if they are little, you know, your secondary students are not your babies. You are not taking care of them and coddling them. They are secondary students, and we're going to use age-appropriate inflection when we talk to them. Importantly, I think at the bottom, it's just a good sort of phrase to keep in mind that past lack of progress in a student does not justify us as educators ceasing to try to encourage that progress or to put something out in front of that student that will allow them to progress. If you have a student come to you after years and years and years of no progress, and you think, well, look at these years of lack of progress. What I can't do anything, that's just where they're at. No, we have to continue trying. There's always something we can try. There's always some new thing coming out. There may be something that was tried in the past that wasn't appropriate in the past, but maybe it will be more appropriate now. So we are always, always, always having to try something. We can't just sit back and let it be. So what? So what about all this talk about presuming competence? I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but these are all the things that are affected when we start off from a point of presuming competence in our students. We get our students more actively engaged because we assume from the beginning that there is more going on there, and so therefore they pick up on that. They pick up on that that idea that you believe they have something to offer, and they then will engage more with you. It influences us to provide more complex materials to them. It influences how often we talk to them, how we speak about them to others. And that last one I think is important to point out. If we start off by presuming competence in students, we assume there's an ability there, it will drastically influence our own willingness to put forth effort and willingness to have patience when we're trying to resolve challenges around this student, whether it's an academic challenge, a behavioral challenge, a scheduling challenge. We will have more grit almost to get through some of these things rather than just throwing up our hands and saying, well, this is just too hard. It's too hard to figure out how to get them into a gen ed math class. I can't do it. We can't do it. It's too hard. Moving on. We're just going to let it go. But if you start from the place of presuming competence, then you'll think, no, there's something going on with that student, and I want to give them that opportunity, so I'm going to keep with it and keep moving forward. When we presume competence in students, it is literally game-changing for them and for their lives as they move on through school and beyond. This gives just a little bit of information about how a lot of these ideas we've been talking about and what we will talk about, how they move or how they all work together. The two that I really want to point out here are the ideas of shared responsibility and meaningful access. So not only does the Every Student Succeeds Act and the sort of the accompanying Dear Colleague letter, the legal pieces of it, not only do those pieces support these ideas, but there's also just a ridiculous amount of research that is starting to come to light and that I have been poring over, trying to further find ways to support the work that we're doing here. And that those are two areas that have really come out as well, the shared responsibility and the meaningful access. So it is no longer a world where a special education student is under the care of a special education teacher and then that's it. They're not segregated in that way anymore. It's a shared responsibility between special ed teachers, gen ed teachers, administrators, related services. Every student belongs to every staff member. All students are gen ed students first. Some may have an identified disability that require additional services and supports and so forth, but they all ultimately, at the very baseline, have the opportunity to be exposed to grade level standards, to be around their non-disabled peers, and so forth. And so that draws in those people, those staff members that we typically would have thought aren't really involved with our students with more significant needs. So there really is a focus on shared responsibility now. And the other piece is meaningful access. So in the past, we were fine with, okay, inclusion is great. We're going to get our students with disabilities in the gen ed setting. We're going to include them. Here we go. We're going to put our student with a disability in the gen ed classroom, and look, there we are. We've included them. And that's more so addressing physical access, but now we are looking at making that access more meaningful and sort of digging for what I call intellectual access. So when you have those two pieces, the physical access and the intellectual access to the curriculum and the content that's going on around them, that's where we really see true inclusion happening. And given that, it's really leading people to start rethinking what it means for a student to be in their LRE, in their least restrictive environment, and what it means to give access to the gen ed setting to these students. I called out here the Dear Colleague letter where it says, in order for FATE to exist, a free and appropriate public education for a student with a disability, that child has to be involved in and make progress in the gen ed curriculum. It doesn't say how much progress. We know that some students with disabilities will make less progress than others, but we forever have to be trying to support and lay out a plan in order for that progress to take place. And one way that happens is to actually have them involved in the gen ed setting. So those are just some ideas to think about as we think about what does it mean to include students with significant disabilities, what do they have the right to be exposed to and have access to, and what does that mean as far as what we're doing with their least restrictive environment. This is another sort of supporting piece. There was a case in the Supreme Court where, this was just a couple years ago, where they really sort of solidified some things that we know and understand about special education and how to develop IEPs and all of that. We really need to make sure that there's a true continuum of services going on in our schools, not just having the programming that we have and a new student comes to us and we say, let's see, I'm going to put you in, you look like you would fit best in this program. We really need the continuum of services, a true continuum of services is being flexible and adapting and modifying what you do have in order to meet the needs of the students that you have in front of you. There was a new and renewed emphasis on specially designed instruction and what that means and how we're going to meet students' needs that way. And then making sure that we're not predetermining services or placement in the IEP development process. And there was also some confirmed significance. So we already know some of the tenets of proper IEP development. The goals have to be measurable. We know that. But they also have to be challenging. That doesn't mean so challenging that they can't be met, but it also means that if a student has the same goal year after year after year after year, something isn't right. Something's not going on that should be going on, and we need to do something to address that. There needs to be continuous monitoring of progress. I think we all know that there needs to be progress monitoring on IEP goals, but the continuous piece is pretty important. It's not just let's set the goal in October at the case conference, and then let's see, I'll check in again in maybe like February, and let me get one in May right before the end of the year. That's not continuous. That may be monitoring some progress, but it's not continuous enough or consistent enough and to be able to change what you're doing in real time to then make progress if no progress had been made previously. And then reconvening if no progress is made. That's pretty big. I know it's a huge pain on everyone's parts to coordinate schedules and get a case conference scheduled, but if there is truly no progress being made for a student, that means something has gone awry. Whether the goal has been written improperly, the progress monitoring data has been taken improperly, or maybe we were not monitoring the correct things, or we're not doing it in a way that's getting us the data we want, or maybe the strategies that we're using with this student and the specially designed instruction that we've put forth, maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe we need to try something else. Something has to be done. We can't just sort of sit back and let things roll along until the next case conference. When we're talking about access, this is just sort of to sum up why it's so important to think about access. A little bit of access goes a long way. So when we start off by giving our students access to the gen ed setting and the gen ed content, that allows them to then have that participation in what's going on around them. First, they have to have the access. Then they can start participating. And then when they participate is when they start to learn. And we can't get to that learning until they're able to participate in it. And we can't get to that participation until we allow them the access. So that's why we sort of harp on this access piece here in the beginning. When you're thinking about, okay, these content connectors and these high academic expectations, that's asking a lot on us as teachers, on us as administrators, on the students themselves who are already dealing with so much. How are we supposed to make this happen? So this slide is another one of those, I would say, if you take nothing away, maybe this is it. When you're thinking about incorporating grade-level academic standards, as well as trying to meet the needs of students at their ability level, I want you to keep in mind the idea of exposure versus mastery. So for students with the most significant disabilities, they have the right to be exposed to grade level content. That doesn't mean we expect them to master it, but they do have the right to be exposed to it, to hear it, to try to engage in it in some way, but we don't necessarily expect mastery of it. What we do expect mastery of is skills that are at or near their ability level. That's where we're going to hone in and really drive for mastery so that they can solidify that skill and sort of move on to the next one. But both of those things need to be happening consistently throughout a student's educational career. We can't only focus on mastery of skills at their level, and we can't only focus on exposing them to grade level content because we think, well, that's what they told me to do. I got to give them grade level content now. Here you go. Again, that idea of it being meaningful as well needs to be included in there. So, again, just thinking about sort of that duality of exposing students to grade level content while also working on mastery of skills at their level. Both of those things need to be going on at the same time. There are ways to do that where it doesn't have to be, okay, this half an hour block is where I'm going to expose you to the gen ed content. Now, for this next half hour is when we're going to work on the mastery of skills that are at your level. There are ways to fuse those things together where you can sort of present a broader lesson where you expose students to some gen ed content, the grade level content, but then you also drill down to a skill or two that's related to that grade level content that you work on actually mastering within that lesson. This, very briefly, just speaks to the power of expectations. In Kansas, several years ago, students were not included in any kind of students with disabilities were not included in any kind of state assessment. Much like we have the IM here, they did not have any kind of assessment. And the blue bars there show you the levels of proficiency that students were at in reading and math. Then there was a change where these students were being held accountable on state assessments, and in just 3 years, their level of proficiency, the percentage of students who were proficient in reading and math nearly doubled. That is not to say that simply taking a state assessment has somehow made twice as many students proficient in reading and math. What it does mean is there was this whole change in accountability, both on the student's part, oh, they actually expect me to know something or to retain something, and on the teacher's part, oh, if these students are going to be in these assessments, I better be teaching them what's going to be on the assessment, right? So the whole idea of having high expectations and then sort of living up to that and living up to that accountability had real drastic results just within 3 years. So I just think that's sort of an anecdote of how powerful it can be to have high expectations for our students. Knowing that in Indiana, the Department of Education is starting to look at sort of a different way of determining of making your determinations as a district. In the past, it was pretty heavily focusing on compliance and data. So are you doing what you're supposed to be doing when you're supposed to be doing it, and are you giving us the information we need? And those things are very important, but now that that view is sort of changing a little bit to take into consideration, okay, and are you getting results from what you're doing? Not just are you compliant, and not just are you giving us some information about what you're doing, but is what you're doing actually having results? So this idea of having high expectations, of putting academic content in front of students with significant disabilities, all of those efforts will be realized and recognized in this new results-driven accountability. And there's much more we could say about that. I put a link down there at the bottom to some of the guidance from the Indiana Department of Education, but this is just to point out that, at least from an administrator's perspective as well, I think oftentimes people think, well, these students, we got to worry about our test scores. We can't have our test scores get down too low, or our pass rate get down too low, and we really got to focus on these students who will be able to make the most progress, right? But now we're looking at the results for everyone across the board. So these students with significant disabilities are now included in this as well. These next couple slides are just examples for administrators to be thinking through both what they do in their own lives as administrators throughout the school, but also when you're thinking about evaluating or observing teachers. These are ways that you can see whether your teachers are reflecting high expectations in the classroom. The only one I want to point out specifically here on this page is the idea of providing more wait time. I think that is a critical and yet overlooked piece of working with students with significant needs. We know that the majority of those students have some kind of processing difficulty or challenge or just require more time to process. And we also know that we are always on the go and we always have one more thing to do and we got to get through this so we can get to the next thing. But when we're thinking about truly reflecting a high expectation for a student, to provide them additional time to think through what you're asking them and be able to potentially give a response is crucial. And I will say, too, for students who have processing difficulties, if you ask the question and you wait a little bit and then you ask it again because you think you're doing a good thing, you're trying to prompt them, maybe they didn't hear me or maybe they didn't understand it the first time, what you've done is restart that whole processing process. And so now they have to go all the way back to the beginning and start processing all over again. So you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with how long you're waiting in order to allow that student to have that time. And that is another way, as I was mentioning earlier, that you can really indicate to a student you believe they have something of value worth contributing when you give them the time to try to contribute it. If you ask the question and then you say, yeah, okay, and moving on, you don't really know that anyway, so we're just going to keep going. When you make a point of giving them that additional time, they sense that and they realize, okay, I might have something to say here. Hold on, let me think about this a minute. These are some other expectations or ways that we show we have high expectations for students in more socio-emotional areas. Again, things to be looking for as you're doing walkthroughs or observations and so forth. This slide, I think, does a good job of sort of giving a visual to the things that we've been talking about so far. So having high expectations for students, it doesn't mean we're trying to be unreasonable with them. It does mean that it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of scaffolding, maybe even this much scaffolding, as shown in the picture. But we know that if we provide that scaffolding, if we find a way to provide those supports to students, there is room for them to progress that we haven't gotten to yet. But if we really structure things intentionally, we can make way for these students to continue to make progress. These quotes I included in here just, again, as another sort of piece of supporting evidence, I guess, of really what it means when we presume competence in students and sort of the benefits that it can have. I know that for some of you listening, I may be preaching to the choir, and you're like, yeah, I get it. I already have high expectations for my students and presume competence in them, and I know they can do more and all of this, but I also know that I'm probably speaking to some skeptics out there in the audience as well who think that this is all sort of crazy talk. So a lot of what we've included in the presentation today are different ways of either, if you are someone who's sort of on board with this idea, ways of being able to present these ideas to other people who may not be on board. And this is one of those slides. These quotes are from a teacher that I've worked with for a couple years now, and they really capture what started happening in her classroom when she made the conscious decision to presume her students had competence. The most powerful one, I think, is that she had a student where, the student's mother herself just sort of assumed that the student would never be able to read, just sort of made an assumption based on, well, that's a function of her disability, reading's just never going to happen for her, and we're just going to move on. Nothing, no bad intent, just sort of figured that's how things were. But this teacher was intentional about presuming competence in this student and thought, you know what, let's see what we can do. If I put this in front of you, if I give you this reading instruction, why not? I presume there's an ability in there somewhere. Let's see what we can do with it. And lo and behold, this child started to learn to read. And it just gives me chills to think about what could have happened if this teacher had not made that intentional presumption, that they didn't consider, maybe she can read, let me try, right? That child could have gone on her whole life never having another adult give her that presumption of competence. So I think it's really powerful to think through that. And this is a real life example of how this can work. And I will say she was one of those skeptics in the audience when I first started working with her, which I think maybe makes it even more powerful to know that she's come around and really seen some results from it. So given all of that, that was my super fast spiel on why it's important to presume competence in students, hold them to high expectations, operate under the least dangerous assumption. But given all of that all sounds well and good, but okay, how do we translate that into the classroom and into instruction and into what we do day-to-day as teachers and as administrators. So what we're going to do now in this sort of second half is look at different bits and pieces of what does effective instruction look like for these students. And you'll see here there are several different sort of areas we're going to go through. I'm going to talk through just a little bit of Content Connectors 101 to make sure we're all on the same page about what they are, why they exist, where they show up, and all of that. And then Heidi will take over and talk about some other tools and strategies and things that will help start implementing these ideas and this presumption of competence and all of that in actual instruction. So let's do a little who, what, when, where, why, how of content connectors. Who are they for? Content connectors are meant to be for students with significant disabilities. We already discussed who that might be, right, that 1%. Another way of looking at it is to consider the criteria here on this screen. These are the criteria for participating in the alternate assessment, IAM. Obviously, if a student is participating in IAM, the alternate assessment assesses the alternate standards. So if they meet the criteria to participate in the alternate assessment, then it is appropriate for them to be working on content connectors, on the alternate standards. And then off to the right there, we just included some additional resources and support regarding the assessment. There's guidance documents that sort of help you understand if it's appropriate for a student to be participating or not, as well as some other frequently asked questions. So those are just additional resources for you to go back to in the future. That's who. What are content connectors anyway? Content connectors are Indiana's alternate academic standards. So it is unique to Indiana to call them content connectors, but across the country, every state has some version of alternate academic standards. The thing that's important to know, the fact that they are alternate does not mean that they are easier. It's not meant to be easier. And so it's really important that if you have a student who is struggling but who isn't necessarily a student who's been identified with a significant cognitive disability, content connectors would not be appropriate for a student who is struggling because content connectors are still quite rigorous. What they are, if they're not easier, what they are is sort of condensed versions of the Indiana academic standards. So it cuts out what it can out of a standard and really hones in on the most critical knowledge and the most critical skills within that standard that a student would need to know to sort of master and move on to the next level. All content connectors are important for instruction. It's important to give students the breadth of what's available in the standards, right? All the content that's available. It's important to expose them to that via instruction. However, not all content connectors are important for assessment. Clearly, an assessment can't cover every single content connector. iLearn doesn't cover every single academic standard. So there's, in thinking through how are we going to get all of this out to our students, it's important to keep in mind that while you may want to expose students to all the content connectors, you want to spend more time on, perhaps, the ones that you know that will be or potentially will be on the assessment. And there are ways to figure out which ones those are, which we will talk about shortly. The when of content connectors, when do you see these? When should they be used? Really all over the place. They should be used when a teacher is planning their lessons. They should be included in the planning of the lesson. They should be showing up in actual instruction of students. They are the basis for IEP goals. IEP goals should be aligned to grade level content connectors, and then of course IAM is where they are assessed. There are a few hyperlinks, documents over to the left, so some additional resources regarding lesson planning. We have our template. There's a screenshot off to the side there. It's kind of a nice way to, there are different boxes that incorporate elements specific to content connectors, like having considerations for different tiers of learners and things like that, that maybe a typical lesson plan wouldn't have, lesson plan template wouldn't have. So there's a link to that. There are also a couple webinars, recorded webinars that we've done in the past. One is specific to lesson planning with content connectors. One is specific to IEP goal writing with content connectors. So those are resources you can check out or share with your teachers if they're needing some additional information that way. And then the last resource on this screen is a link to the IAM blueprints. The blueprints are how the testing vendor decides how to generate the assessment, essentially. So a group of educators come together, they review the content connectors, they decide, there's a whole process to it, but they essentially decide what they feel like are the most important content connectors to be assessed, and then the testing vendor takes that information and builds the assessment accordingly. So these blueprints are a way to determine how frequently a content connector may appear on the assessment. They're kind of, they can be a little overwhelming, a little complicated to look at, but the information is there. And I will say, too, that Project Success here in a little while will have reference documents that have the content connectors sort of aligned, so like a K through 5 showing how the content connectors align through that grade band, and we'll also be indicating a priority level on there as well in terms of how often it might show up on the assessment. So that should be a helpful resource to have when you're thinking through how do I figure out which of these content connectors to teach and how much time to spend on them. Where are these content connectors being used? Asterisk, where they should be being used in the least restrictive environment, which is not necessarily a physical location. The least restrictive environment is really more of an idea of making sure that students have access to as much as possible that their non-disabled peers have access to, that we're not restricting them in any way just because we're trying to provide them with a special service or support because of their disability. We also need to make sure that they have access to the gen ed setting as much as possible. So again, being in the gen ed setting when it's appropriate to the maximum extent appropriate. We already talked about how that does not mean what's easiest. But also, it calls out in the Dear Colleague letter and in ESSA that students with disabilities should be spending as much time as possible with non-disabled peers. So that has nothing to do with academics. That's all about social things, right? Being able to just be in the presence of non-disabled peers. So that's where you should see content connectors coming out in gen ed settings as well. This may be the third thing, the third piece that I will say, if you take nothing else away from today, let it be this. The block on the right, that box on the right, is a quote from some research that was done in the 90s. And there's actually some additional supporting research that's come out more recently, but interestingly, it existed already in the 90s, that when students with disabilities are included in a gen ed setting, the achievement of those students with disabilities, as well as the achievement of the students in that gen ed classroom, is not significantly impacted by the inclusion of the students with disabilities. So something that we hear quite often is, when we're sort of encouraging and emphasizing the importance of including students with significant disabilities in gen ed, we hear, but what about the other kids? It's going to distract the other students. It's going to take time away from the teacher focusing on the other students. And this research shows that long-term, longitudinally, achievement by all students with disabilities or without disabilities is not significantly impacted. Now, on a day-to-day basis, week by week, might you have some chaos in your classroom? Absolutely. No one is saying that when you zero in on one part of one day that it might not just be a complete disaster. Yeah, could be. A gen ed class full of gen ed students could be a complete disaster on any given day, right? But this research shows that when you track over time, the long-term impact is almost nothing. So I think that is a key piece in helping bring general educators on board. It is easy as a gen ed teacher to get stuck in the day-to-day and think, this is a mess. I can't do this. This is a distraction from this. They're taking away from this. But it is huge to keep in the back of your mind the understanding that when you have the ability to look at it from higher above and from a longer-term perspective, academic performance is not impacted by this inclusion that we are emphasizing. And the why. Why do we have these content connectors? Well, because we are having this emphasis on high expectations. Content connectors provide a vehicle for having high expectations for students with significant disabilities. There are a couple of resources here that are great videos to sort of emphasize that, to share with you or with other people to get more information on those things. But in general, I think it's important to know that regardless of whether a student is going to go on to college, go on to a career of some kind, or whether they are going on to just participate in their community as independently as possible, all of those things, the readiness for all of those things is enhanced when students have increased academic competence. And there's no way for a student to get that increased academic competence if we don't provide those opportunities and have those higher expectations. A student can't learn what we don't teach them, so we have to at least give them the opportunity. How are we going to get all this done? I sort of touched on it earlier when I mentioned the IM blueprints and the prioritizing, but we also want to think about balancing both functional skills and academic skills. So no one is saying now with this emphasis on academics that we are doing away with working on functional skills. Obviously, students with significant disabilities have significant needs, and we need to be targeting that and working on that as well. But now it's about a balance of those two things. Right? You know, in the past, a life skills program was pretty specifically targeting life skills and didn't have a lot of academics. And now we're really bringing both of those into balance. I will say about that too, with the infusing piece, we're really, in order to make that happen, make time for working on functional and academic skills, we want to look at how we can infuse that. So whether it is a more functionally based time or activity or skill that you're working on and you find a way to incorporate a little bit of academics, like for instance, many classrooms have a cooking time, maybe, you know, in the secondary, maybe every Friday is when they work on cooking. That's great. That's a perfectly functional skill to be working on, but there are ways to incorporate academics into that. It doesn't have to just be working on the procedures of cooking. We can also start targeting some academics in there as well. Great for working on measurement or fractions or even just reading the recipe card or sequencing the steps in the recipe and all of that. Those are all academic skills that can be infused into that more functionally based activity. And the reverse of that is true as well. So if you have a more academically based lesson that you're working on, you're wanting to present content of some sort, you can still be working on more functional type skills. You know, the example I think of a lot is when we have sort of separate social skills groups set aside to, okay, this is when we're going to work on being a good friend and waiting your turn and commenting appropriately to a peer and all of these things. And those are clearly really good skills to be working on. But those things can be worked on in conjunction with having some academic content around it, right? So maybe in this small group, you're going to be talking about some kind of academic concept or topic, but you're also going to be able to work on, okay, wait, oh, hold on, I see you have something you want to share, but right now it's so-and-so's turn, so we're going to wait and let so-and-so share about the whatever academic concept it is, and then, you know, sort of move on from there. So the key piece here is to think about the balance and the infusion of those two things, because we all know nobody has time to do all the things, so we have to be creative about how we mush them together and to get everything done. This is just a quick review for anyone who might need to kind of just refer back to what does it mean, what do these content connectors mean. This is just a quick review to go back to later. So now I will turn it over to Heidi, and she is going to be reviewing some tools and strategies that will support all of these ideas of high expectations that we've been talking about so far. Heidi.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Ash. So all the work that Ashley was just talking about and all the strategies that we can utilize to support high expectations in students, we're going to talk about some of those. And here is just a visual to talk, just to show you some of the things that you can use to support students in high expectations. We're going to talk about unpacking content connectors, talking about how we align those content connectors to the general education curriculum. We're talking about curriculum mapping, specially designed instruction, as well as UDL, Universal Design for Learning. All right. So let's talk about, I think Ashley's going to do the slides for me here. Are you going to flip it, Ash? Let's talk about unpacking content connectors. What goes into that? When we're talking about unpacking the content connectors, we have a great template, and then many of your teachers, if they've attended any of our project success training, have gone through the unpacking process and utilized this template to really think about breaking those content connectors down into smaller bits or pieces so that we can identify where the student is at and where the student needs to go when thinking about those content connectors. So when we're talking about content connectors, we're talking about the skills that are needed to master content connectors. How do we apply that to everyday life or everyday bits of curriculum for students? And then what are those key vocabulary skills that are necessary, or words, whether those are the academic vocabulary or the core vocabulary when we're talking about students who really struggle with language. So let's look at an unpacking template and talk through one. So here, if you've not seen what the Project Success Unpacking template looks like, you can find this template on our website. The best thing is just to download a copy of it, then you can begin working on it. They are editable templates. So at the top, you can see we are going to list the content connector. And then I think everybody does completing this unpacking template differently, but many of us like to start we skip down to the middle box, which talks about what access skills are required for every student to master this grade level content connector. So this is what are those skills that are needed for mastery of this? And those skills could be anywhere from just having a communication system, having a way to communicate. It could be being able to be engaged for more than 5 minutes. It could be wherever they're at that is connected to this content connector. But this list would be very extensive for some people. It just depends on where you're at as far as breaking it down and when you're thinking about as a teacher when you're breaking down this template. Then if you go down to the next one, what access skills describe barriers for students access? That's where we're going to really be thinking about our own students. Like, what are the barriers for our own students to access this grade level content connectors? And then we're going to go back up to skills and concepts. And then Ash is going to go ahead and do the slide. And we're going to look at one done, and we'll talk through it a little bit more. Okay, so here's a third grade unpacking template for a third grade content connector. And as you see, like I talked about in that middle, that access skills are required for every student. Mode of communication is often the #1 thing for any student, correct? And then thinking about being able to listen to attend to instruction. And then really looking at that content connector and breaking down what are some other skills that are related to that content connector, like knowing the difference between the people or objects, identifying details, being able to categorize, being able to describe those characters. And then this teacher in particular went down then for barriers, and then thinking about where her students are at, know the difference between people and objects, and identifying relative details. That's where her students are at. Those barriers are going to be where the students' IEP goals come from. That's where the students are at, and that's where you're going to be working with them on those IEP goals. The skills, you go back up, and then you're going to, those skills are those verbs. Those are the ones to do. And in this content connector, breaking it down, the two skills that we need to do are to identify and to describe. And then when you're thinking about the concepts, those are what does the student know already? Those are the nouns. Those are the WH questions. So in here it would be the who and the why. And for traits, it would be details. What are the details about the characters? And the feelings, what kind of emotions, what are emotions, and what kind of emotions do these characters have? So that's how a student, now I went it over very quickly. Typically, when teachers are working through content connectors and unpacking, it is a long process, and teachers usually work in groups or at least partners and kind of are able to have that conversation back and forth about what they typically do, and sometimes they'll think of exact lessons that they've been able to use these content connectors unpacking for. I think Ashley has the next one is a secondary example as well. So your teachers, if they've worked with Project Success in the past, many of your teachers have been through this unpacking process. And typically, if you're new to unpacking, we often start with those priority standards that Ashley talked about for the IM assessment. We look at those priority standards for the grade level or grade levels that teachers are instructing on, and we start with those priority standards that we definitely know are going to be on the assessment and work through unpacking those as we move through. By no means can you get the unpacking process done in 1 year. Oftentimes it's over a couple of years and you're working through a couple subject areas at a time, or you have teams working on it in your district. Ashley, did you want to say anything else? Because you usually have a comment or two of that.
I do. I usually have a comment about a lot of things. I would just point out, you're exactly right, that if the goal is to unpack all the content connectors, that can be quite an extensive process, and it does take some long-term sort of planning. But that shouldn't keep anyone from just dive in and pick a content connector and just try unpacking it. Just for instructional purposes, you want to dive in and just see what happens. There's no reason why you can't. If you know a lesson's coming up, or you want to pick a content connector that's pretty universal, like describing characters in a story or citing evidence. That's a pretty broad skill. Just choose that content connector. Work on unpacking it a little bit, and at least get your feet wet with it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So it can be a big, overwhelming, long process if the goal is to do all of them, but that shouldn't stop you from also just sort of doing what you can in the meantime.
And because this is an administrative webinar, I want to tell you this is really actually a great tool. If you have a teacher who's struggling and you want to coach them through a lesson, if you've reviewed, if you've gone and observed one of their lessons and they're really struggling because you don't think they're really hitting the mark of maybe at that student's level, or they're missing some skills that you think would have been very helpful for the students to master, this would be a great tool that you could use to coach alongside a teacher and help them think about an actual lesson and how to break down whatever content connector that they're teaching through that lesson. Or even it doesn't even have to be a content connector. You could be using an academic standard if it's a gen ed teacher as well, but breaking down that standard and really thinking about what are the skills that are needed to be able for the student to do that content connector, and what they need to know ahead of time, and then what those barriers are. So this is a great tool for administrators as you're coaching through new teachers or a teacher who's struggling as well. All right, general education alignment. So as we think about many of our students are, they're in more and more inclusive practices and or in inclusive settings, we're thinking about how do we help students prepare to be in those settings. So when we're doing that, we're really thinking about how do we align our curriculum? How do we align the content connectors? How do we align what we're teaching in self-contained classrooms to inclusive practices, and how do we think about curriculum? This is a great tool that you'll find on our website. It's our curriculum and resource list. We by no means are really promoting any of the curriculum here. These are simply a list of curriculum that has been shared with us that several or one or more of our teachers who have been with Project Success for a while are utilizing. They're listed according to subjects, grade level, and then if there's a cost, we put there if they're free or if there's a cost. And then we typically note about a little bit about that curriculum. This is very helpful. I know many school systems have gone to purchasing ULS, but there are some that have not. And some teachers are struggling with finding some curriculum resources or things, different types of resources to utilize when they're thinking about unpacking or when they are doing some curriculum mapping. So this is a great tool. So if you are looking for this, you just go onto our website, and this link is a live link, like Ashley said. It's this PowerPoint. If you download the PowerPoint, it would take you right to this link. But if not, this list is located on our website as well. All right, talking a little bit about curriculum mapping. So this is another way that you can align to the curriculum, and for teachers who are working in more of a self-contained setting, or if they do have students with inclusive experiences, that they can get students prepared and they are on the same focus as the gen ed curriculum and gen ed as their gen ed peers. So here's an example of one. And this too, I want to give you kind of that note too, that this too takes a while. This is a process that happens over a long period of time with a team of teachers working together, or at least a pair. It's a big endeavor to take on by yourself. It's really thinking about having that partnership between a special education teacher and a gen ed teacher, having them really kind of see students through different lenses, both of them, and kind of looking about what are the resources, what's the vocabulary that is available for students. So typically, we've given you a couple in this PowerPoint, I think towards the end, different curriculum maps, but typically the special education teacher would get the curriculum maps from the gen ed teacher, whether it be maybe a department head or the director of curriculum. And you're going to take that curriculum map with the general education. That's where those Indiana academic standards are, the second column in. And then you're going to align that to the content connectors, talk about the skill of what you want students to know during that content, during that unit, during that lesson, however that's listed. Then list the assessment, what you're going to be you want your students to be able to do. And then vocabulary. And we like to kind of, this example just shows you the vocabulary, kind of the academic vocabulary, that Friends vocabulary, but oftentimes if you're working with the students with more significant disabilities, you might want to list your core vocabulary there as well. And then the great thing about this is what we talked about with the teachers as we're working through this is listing all the resources that you've utilized in the past. And then, this, just like our IEPs are a living document, this curriculum map is really a living document. So we're keeping this curriculum map up to date as we teach it, each quarter or each semester, adding those resources that you found, or as you're working with your peer teachers, other resources that can be added to this unit so that you'll be able to have them for the next year. All right, so talking about specially designed instruction. So when we're talking about that, the definition is adapting content, methods, or instructional delivery to address the unique needs of students. So what we're talking about here is that what does a student need that the special education can provide? So what do you as a teacher do differently that you're going to be able to help students master the content or have exposure to the content? So it's not what the student's going to do, it's what you as the instructor is going to do. And when we're thinking about that, we need to be planning that ahead of time, organizing that, making sure it's meaningful and that it's intentional, and that it addresses that in the student's IEP goals and their objectives. And so I know that that's a piece that was just added a couple of years ago to the IEP process, and some teachers really struggle with that. But I think the key is to remember, what are you going to do differently in your instruction so that students are able to have access and be able to master the curriculum? It's not what the student's going to do, it's what the teacher's going to do for when delivering their instruction. So what it is in addition to the core instruction, it's a service, it's a support, like what is a teacher going to do? And it's very specific to each student's individual needs. It also helps to promote independence so that students can have a chance at having a scaffolding of supports as the students gain more confidence in that skill. And it's breaking down those barriers, letting students have that opportunity to learn specific skills and taking away the barriers where it's not allowing students to access it. And it is a description of what all educators need to do. So like I said, a special design instruction is not about what the student's going to do or what the student's program is going to look like or their schedule is going to look like. It's about what the teachers are going to do to help students access the curriculum or master skills. All right, UDL. So UDL is really thinking about the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. UDL is being flexible and having that flexibility so that students can access materials and they can engage in it and they can show what they learn. So it is really thinking about having students, how students can engage in a lesson, and that could be unique to each student, or it could be unique to a certain group of students. Thinking about how students are able to gain the knowledge and then how they're able to express that they have that knowledge. And then thinking about how differently students learn. So it's really thinking about different strategies that are directed towards the learner that's differentiating between each student specific to their needs, not having the same instruction for all students. And it's not just one way of teaching. So it's maybe teaching a subject matter in multiple different ways. There's two great resources on the top of this slide. Patton's UDL Lesson Creator is awesome, as well as if you have been on the cast.org site, there's also much more information about UDL. There's so much information about UDL out there, actually, and I would encourage your teachers, if they're struggling, thinking about how to design instruction differently for each student, or if they have a classroom full of students who are really have a wide range of abilities and learning styles, that they really think about UDL and how differently planning and being intentional about planning and how to engage students differently will really help their lessons. So I would encourage you to access those resources and share that with your teachers. All right, so kind of moving into kind of that secondary role, thinking about certificate of completion resources. So these are all live links to the resources that are on the Indiana Department of Education website for certificate of completion. There's the course of study if you've not seen that. There's the applied course descriptions. There's also the applied course descriptions with their content connector alignment, and then there's some 4-year plan, 6-year plan, and then just some facts and answers and questions on there as well. So I think Ash is going to go to the next slide, and that is the course of study. I think that everybody has probably by now seen that. This has been into effect for a couple of years now, but is mandated that it will be into effect this school year. Last year, most school districts piloted it, but this year is the year where it will be the accountability for the course of study. So we do know that for secondary, for incoming freshmen this year, that they will be required for their certificate of completion to create either 40 units or credits. Students can, for their course of study, have credits or units, and that is based upon what your course book says at your district. The difference between credits and units mostly would be credits are classes that are taken where the curriculum is not modified, that it is accommodated but not modified. Units are the courses that students are taking that have a modified curriculum in them. Also the other thing that is going to affect this year is about the transition portfolio that students who are on the certificate of completion do need to have completed when they are receiving their certificate of completion. Students in the state of Indiana will be working mostly through Indiana Career Explorer if that's the platform that their district chooses, but your district might have Naviance or another platform, and you may utilize that, but I think the biggest one, most often used one will be the Indiana Career Explorer. If you've not registered yet, these are the portfolio regional trainings that are occurring right now. I did attend the Fort Wayne one on the 22nd, and I know that these other ones are coming up. They are morning sessions and afternoon sessions, and Michelle Oja, our transition specialist, will be going through the Indiana Career Explorer and how that relates to the portfolio for students with most significant needs. She also shows you another option of using Google Slides, a template that she and a colleague have created that you may utilize for the portfolio for students with the most significant needs. And so she's going to walk you through that. And she also gives you some work time. Do make sure that you take a computer with you or anybody who signed up, because you are going to have plenty of time to work through those two platforms for your students. But like I said, that guidance, and there's also going to be a new guidance coming out for that, spread the word guidance, coming out in late August, hopefully. Skip one. Yeah, go back one, Ash. All right, so moving on, like I said, remember this is a condensed version of our webinar. It is not the whole thing that we went over 3 hours during our summer regional training. So I am kind of moving a little bit quickly through a couple different topic areas. So if you wanted to see the full PowerPoint slide, that is going to be on our website, and you can look at that. So take a moment. So oftentimes we get the question about thinking about the observation process and the walkthrough, the evaluation process of teachers who are working with students with most complex or significant needs. And so just thinking about that, what are some things that you do? Oftentimes administrators kind of don't feel like they have a confidence level to do that because they've not taught in a classroom like that, or they have not worked with students with most complex needs. So just be thinking about, when you're thinking about going to do an observation or a walkthrough, think about the things that Ashley talked about earlier. Are those students, being presented with high expectations? Are those students being presented with the exposure to the academic standards? Is a teacher utilizing the content connectors? Is a teacher making sure that everybody has some type of communication? And is the teacher then in tune using all the different types of communication so that she's reaching all the students in her class? Do you know what the clear focus is, what the clear goals are that are happening in that classroom? Is it evident? And do you see some formative assessment going on? What you shouldn't see definitely when you go in classrooms, self-contained classrooms or classrooms with students, but in the secondary level especially, you shouldn't see them watching movies often, nursery rhymes, baby toys, when it's not age appropriate. Like Ashley said earlier in the webinar, if we have the expectation that our students are going to be like their age-like peers and they're going to have some kind of social interaction with their age-like peers, we want them to be able to have interest levels and have exposure to things that are at their age level so that they can have something to have in common with those age-like peers. So when we're thinking about that, we want to make sure that what you see in the classroom is what should be happening so that students can be independent as much as possible or can be related to their peers. You want to see that their social skills or soft skills, those life skills are embedded in their academic tasks as well. You want to see that balance that Ashley talked about. You want to see a balance between life skills and academic skills. You want to see students that have significant disabilities engage with gen ed peers as much as possible. And you want to see academically rich resources. So you don't want to see, elementary decorations in a high school setting. You want to see appropriate resources, anchor charts, reference posters, different resources that are in the classroom that are appropriate for students and their age level. You want to see skills going on, academic skills going on, not leisure time all the time. And you want to make sure that they're being exposed to the curriculum. Evidence-based practice planning, so making sure that your teachers are using best practices for working with students with most significant needs. When you're looking at their lesson plans or their IEP goals, you want to ensure that they're aligned to the grade level content connectors. You want to make sure that the curriculum maps foster access to the gen ed content as much as possible and into inclusive settings as much as possible. You want to see an emphasis on daily instruction and what the teacher is actually instructing, not just that they're scheduling and they're worrying about programming. There is exposure to that grade level content, and there's mastery at the skill level that the student is at, but there is exposure. Those social skills are embedded, and they're embedded in age-appropriate tasks. That all students have some kind of mode of communication. Oftentimes, we've seen in the past that we have high school students who still have no mode of communication. That should be a key for that team, that the team of educators working with that student, whether it's the teacher, the SLP, the OT, but all working together to help that student gain a mode of communication, so that we can access what they're learning. And there needs to be a balance between the academic vocabulary that I talked about earlier and the balance with core vocabulary. that 80% of vocabulary that students use daily. So here's, we have posted this on the website, and here's the link to it, but this is a lesson rubric tool that you may utilize when you're looking at a lesson for a teacher who is working with students with low significant needs. The criteria is on the left, some look-fors, what you need to look for, and then how you can rate it: highly effective, effective, developing, or ineffective. This is just a great tool for you to think about when you, like I said, when you're coaching those teachers, especially new teachers or teachers new to working with this population. This would give you a great starting point to have those conversations about their lessons and about what instruction is going on in the classroom. This is another great tool that we've developed. It's a walkthrough tool. We know many districts now have to do so many walkthroughs and so many evaluations, and so this will give you just a quick tool that you could keep on a clipboard, or you could even use it on your device. Just give you some check boxes of what to be looking for daily, and then a summary, and then a recommendation for your staff what to do next after that walkthrough. But this, many of our administrators have asked us for a quick tool to be able to use that is appropriate for working with students with most significant needs, and so we've created this walkthrough tool for you. So we always want to end one of our webinars or one of our trainings to be thinking about, so we gave you lots of information. Hopefully some of it is review for you guys, some of it might be new, but we really want you to think about how you're going to manage this information. How will you take it back to your school? What does it look like in your school? And what are some areas that you might need to do some more investigation, whether it be through our website, looking through all the other resources, participating in one of our office calls. Later in the fall, we're going to be having some office calls for teachers and administrators. It could be any of those things, but we'd like you to click on this planning template when we're done sometime this week or soon, and think about completing that. Like, what are some topics that you need more information about? What will you do first? What are the resources you need? What's the priority level? And then when you complete it, just really kind of keeping some track there of that template. We know that the best intentions happen when we're intentional about creating a plan, creating goals, and creating a tool that we can go back and look at later and kind of assess how we've done. So we've given you a template for that. We want to remind you again that in the fall, we're going to have the fall regional training. This training is for teachers who are new to Project Success, maybe a brand new teacher, or maybe somebody new to just the field of working with students with more complex needs, or anybody interested. Maybe if you have a student teacher, they could also attend. Anybody who's interested in working in the field with students with most complex needs, this will be a great training for you. That link is a live link, like Ashley told you before, so we encourage you to register so that your teachers have a spot for that. And also then all the stuff that we covered today, but in more intense, actually will be for teachers, so that they'll know how to then access the resources and be able to utilize those during the school year. For this webinar and for our regional trainings, we will be having a follow-up webinar that will be happening in January 2020. I know that's hard to believe, but Mary will be sending out a specific date and time that will be available, and the registration for that. But we will use your great evaluations that you send to us and tell us about what other kind of topics you want to know about, or what you guys need more information about, and that's what we'll be developing that webinar so that we can give you more resources to help as we do this endeavor of working with our students. Also, we want to remind you that we have 3 fantastic online courses for paraprofessionals. So if you have new paraprofessionals to your school system, or you have ones that didn't work on these last year, this will be a great way to provide some training. They are online courses. You click there to enroll your paraprofessionals, and then they'll be given a link to participate. We'll also be adding 3 additional courses sometime in this next school year for those of you that of your staff that have already completed the first 3. But I would encourage you to have this is a great training for paraprofessionals to participate in. Questions? Does anybody have any questions? Did we miss something that you were hoping to hear today? Is there anything that you would like us to cover in that January webinar? Or is there something that during our office calls in the fall that you would want to know more about? Go ahead and post that on the chat, or feel free to send us an email, and we will make sure that we have those resources for you. And we have about 1 minute to fill out the evaluation for us. We always love to read the evaluations because we always want to, include any new things that you guys need and to hear your feedback. We would encourage you, like I said, to fill out that thing. Also, on the rest of this PowerPoint, you're going to see all kinds of additional resources about for scheduling purposes for students, for working through the course of study for the alternate diploma. So there's several different examples. Our email is also on there, mine and Ashley's, and if you have any kind of questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll be glad to answer those questions for you.
So just as a reminder, we'll have the PowerPoint itself as well as the recorded presentation. Both of those things will be posted on our website after today. You get to it by going to projectsuccessindiana.com, clicking on resources, and then it'll be in the Summer Institute section. And we'll send, yes, everyone who's registered to participate today will automatically receive an email with the link as well. All right.
Thank you all for joining. We appreciate it.
Yes, I know we crammed a lot in today. Thanks so much for sticking with us. And if you have any questions, concerns, like Heidi said, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help support. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.